Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq, coming to you live from the market site in Times Square, New York City. Joining me is Michael Wigmore. He is a partner at Vinson Elkins in the environmental and natural resources practice. We're going to discuss decarbonizing ambitions for the power sector, looking around the years of 2035. Mike, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks for having me.
And there's been a lot of discussion about the need for additional transmission infrastructure to support the build out of all the renewable generation like wind in order to meet the nation's mandates for renewable energy goals. Can you give us an idea of the scope and the scale of additional transmission that's needed?
Sure, Jill. So it's relatively easy to construct wind power generation facilities. So, you're talking about the plains, Iowa, Nebraska, or even now, because the current administration is very supportive, building generation offshore, off the Atlantic coast. The challenge is to get that power to where it's needed. So from Nebraska, Iowa to Chicago, the Atlantic into Boston or New York City, and that's where the real challenges rise. So there's been a couple studies done. DOE cites a study from Princeton that says that the amount of transmission has to increase by 60% by the end of this decade in order to accommodate this build out. Harvard had a study where the numbers are a little bit higher, that it has to double. But to give you an idea of what that means, one way to measure high voltage transmission capacity in the United States is through megawatt miles, the amount of infrastructure it takes to move 1 megawatt of power 1 mile, okay? And so the United States currently has about 150 million megawatt miles of transmission. Now, to meet the goals that the federal government and a number of states have, to increase that by 60 or 100%, just to give you an idea, there's a project called the Southern Cross Project in Texas, and that would be a 400-mile, 2,000 megawatt project to bring wind from West Texas east into Louisiana and Mississippi, okay? That project would be 800,000 megawatt miles. They've been trying to build that project since 2009. Optimistically, right now, they hope to get it in service by 2026. So that's a 17-year development. That would increase the transmission capability in the United States by a little over 0.5%. So when you think about it, we would need to build the equivalent of 120 to 200 Southern Cross projects over the next 7 to 8 years, which is beyond aspirational, right? It's almost borderline delusional that kind of build out can occur.
It might be a naive question. So we live in New Jersey.
Yep.
We do get power from other parts of the countries like the plains that come to the extreme coasts?
No, most of the power, you can't, it's very, very difficult
Right.
to transmit power. That's the difference, is it's hard, the mid-continent ISO, which is basically the plain states, it's very hard to transfer power from mid-continent into New Jersey's and PJM. And so there's not a lot of power that's generated. That power actually gets stuck, for the most part, out there, and it's very difficult to get it out to other regions.
Is there anything that the federal government can do to encourage the build out of additional transmission infrastructure? Are there limits to what the federal government can actually do?
Sure. So you have to think of transmission as kind of a three-legged stool, okay? There's planning, which is where you're going to build new transmission and why. There's cost allocation, which is who's going to pay for it. And then there's the actual siting. Now, historically, planning was done in order to build transmission to increase reliability or to increase efficiency or to service new demand in load areas. And cost allocation, there's a rule that basically says that the cost has to be allocated roughly commensurate with the benefits received by the person served. And that was kind of easy, but it was more retrospective in nature. FERC is currently got a proposed rule out that's going to look at the planning and cost allocation aspects of it in order to try and incentivize and facilitate this transition to renewable generation around the country. But the third leg of the stool is siting, and that is the one that FERC doesn't have any authority over, and that's where a lot of these projects like the Southern Cross project we just talked about are having troubles, because siting is within the jurisdiction solely of states.
So then can you address the federal backstop siting authority that has been the subject of a lot of recent discussion, and can you also help citing issues in the event states oppose specific transmission projects?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion about this backstop siting authority. It was actually enacted in 2005 in the Energy Policy Act, and the problem is that it just doesn't work. It has two fatal flaws, one of which was that initially you couldn't use that authority if a state affirmatively denied a certificate for a project. You could only use it if a state failed to act. That flaw was addressed in the recent infrastructure bill. So in theory, you can use it if the state denies a certificate. The problem is that certificate doesn't grant you eminent domain authority over state lands, and states have tremendous land holdings, and you can't build a transmission line without crossing state lands. So they own the bottoms of all navigable rivers, they have state parks and forests, they own most of the land beneath the interstate highway system. And so if you don't have eminent domain authority, if a state denies you a certificate for a project for whatever reason, you know, you go to FERC, get a backstop certificate, you still have to build the line, and you come to the state, and the state's going to say, you know, we told you we don't want the line, and you're not going to get to cross our highway, you're not going to get to cross our land. So it just doesn't work, and it can never be used over the opposition of a state.
So it seems like the decarbonization of the power sector, it sounds like it's really ambitious, but it's going to be a challenge building the infrastructure out. Even when you think about offshore wind, the transmission constraints, is that an issue for onshore and offshore? What are some of the differences?
There are. They each have their own issues. You know, we talked about the Southern Cross project as onshore. There are other, you know, a lot of folks have heard about the New England Clean Energy Connect line. That's not a wind line, it's a line to bring hydro power from Quebec predominantly down to Massachusetts to meet Massachusetts renewable goals. You know, that project is tied up in litigation in Maine. You know, there was a project before that called Northern Pass, where it was essentially to serve the same purpose, to go through New Hampshire, and New Hampshire shot it down. So, you know, that's kind of the planning and siting side on the onshore. There's also, as we talked about, if you try and bring interregional power, so there's a transmission line that's proposed called So Green, which is going to go from Mid-Continent ISO into the kind of Chicago area, but from a planning standpoint, it's hard for PJM to accommodate, you know, what is effectively generation in the Mid-Continent ISO. The planning just doesn't work very well. So, you know, and FERC's going to look at those issues. Offshore, they're a little bit different. One of the biggest issues with offshore on the East Coast is the limited number of interconnection points. So you have New York that wants to generate 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. New Jersey wants to generate 7.5 gigawatts. But look at New Jersey. There's only really 2 valid interconnection points off the coast of New Jersey. One is up by South Amboy, one is down by Atlantic City. So you're trying to bring all this power into limited interconnection points where the system isn't designed to receive it. So the early movers in offshore wind have a tremendous advantage. So if you look at like Vineyard Wind, it's going to interconnect in a relatively small substation in Hyannis, Massachusetts. That's a Massachusetts project. If you look at South Fork, which is a New York project, it's going to interconnect into East Hampton. Relatively close, relatively easy interconnect. The problem is you can't continue to push more power into those areas because you don't have the capacity to bring the power off of Cape Cod or off of Long Island. So you have to find other interconnects. So if you look at the Beacon Wind project, one of the projects from New York, that project is actually located south of Nantucket, but it's going to interconnect in Queens. And that's a 200-mile, you know, undersea transmission line to interconnect, that's a, you know, many hundreds of millions of dollars just to get that power to where it's needed. And so then, you know, there's another interesting issue. You know, PJM did a study last year looking at what is the onshore infrastructure, transmission infrastructure that has to be built in order to accommodate all this offshore wind. And PJM determined that predominantly because of New Jersey's goals, there has to be a 500 kV transmission line built from west of Philadelphia down to Baltimore. That gets a cost allocation. Who's going to pay for that, right? I mean, it's needed because of these states that want to bring in a lot of offshore wind, Pennsylvania doesn't have a renewable goal. You know, Maryland has a renewable goal, but it's interconnecting through Delaware because Maryland doesn't have any valid interconnection points on the Atlantic coast. So you've got this transmission line that PJM estimates is going to be $250, $300 million. You know, who's going to pay for it? These are all it's very difficult questions.
So the obvious question is, are there any states or regions that are better prepared than others to help scale these kinds of projects?
Yeah, you know, oddly, New York is actually, I think, New York, which has the most aggressive renewable goals, certainly for offshore wind, 9 gigawatts, and also New York wants to decarbonize its transmission or its electric generation by 2040, because New York has its own ISO. Okay, so that is the entity that does the planning and the cost allocation, and it's limited to New York. So New York can determine that it wants to, for example, there's a transmission line called New York Clean Path that was just approved, which is going to bring wind power from northern and western New York downstate to the New York metropolitan area. New York, because it operates its own ISO, can not only do the planning and say this transmission line is needed solely to bring renewable power downstate, but they can also address the cost allocation issue. And what New York is going to do is they're going to basically socialize the costs statewide so that everybody in the state is going to pay for the line, because New York has made a determination that it's in the public interest for the state of New York to develop this. And for the same reason that states can block lines if they, you know, with backstop certificates, New York can also use its lands in order to site lines that it wants to see built. So there's something called the Champlain-Hudson Power Express line, which is bring predominantly hydropower down from Quebec to New York City. Well, that's going to be sited, you know, it's going to be an undersea line that goes through Lake Champlain, which New York owns on the New York side, and then it has to cross some terrestrial areas and then jump into the Hudson River, which New York also owns. So it's easier for New York to actually do the siting. So it controls really all 3 legs. And then finally, New York, because it's made a determination that it's going to go down this road, it's emphasizing development. There's something called the Brooklyn Clean Energy Hub, because one of the problems, as we discussed, was the limited number of interconnection points. So the New York PSC actually ordered Con Ed to come up with a plan for how do you bring all this offshore wind into New York, and Con Ed has proposed to build an offshore mesh system that limits the number of interconnection points that goes into Brooklyn in an old area of 2 old peaking plants, but it could actually interconnect 6 gigawatts of wind offshore without every one of them having to find their own radial line.
To put it into context, 6 gigawatts, what does that power?
Jeez.
Like, does it power all of Times Square? Does it, you know, what, to put it into context so we can.
You know, I'm sorry, I can't even tell you at a 6 gigawatt level how much that is. It's 2/3 of New York's goal of 9 gigawatts.
So,
you know, with this one system,
yeah.
But yeah, I can't even tell you how
but
much.
Obviously it's massive.
It's a lot.
You know, we're pushing the renewable energy agenda, but it does take a lot of money, infrastructure, and then all of the obstacles that you had mentioned. It seems to be more easier in theory than it might necessarily be in practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, the transition's going to occur. I'm
right.
not saying it's not. It's going to take a lot longer and cost a lot more than I think people are anticipating. And outside of areas like New York that controls, you know, that can control all 3 legs, you know, there's still some very, very difficult, not just planning and cost allocation issues, but siting issues. Or
right.
How do you build these transmission lines, like you said, if you want to get wind power from the plains to the East Coast, you've got 6 states to go through.
Right.
I mean, you know, there's a project out there called the Grain Belt Express that was to bring power from basically Kansas up into Illinois, and Missouri for years has opposed the project because Missouri didn't need the power. It was just transferring it through. You know, that project looks like they've now cut a deal with Missouri, but the next project is not as easy because they're not going to have eminent domain authority.
All right, Mike. Interesting insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.